Our loving God in heaven, we thank you for bringing us together again today, for the messages that have inspired us all these years and reviewed this morning. We thank you. We come to worship you, to learn more about you and your kingdom. And we realize that we need to understand the enemy in order to understand ourselves. So we thank you for Bible prophecy, how it brings the kingdoms of this world to light. And as we look at that again today, we pray for your guidance and direction, that you will show us what is needed and what is not. So, Lord, do not leave us until you bless us. We ask in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, so we are continuing to look at China. And I have rewritten the board that I had previously and started it in 1989 so I could fit some more on. There'll be more that will need to be put down at the end eventually. But I have just taken away all the history prior to 1989 and left out the interim histories between 1989, 2001 and 2014, just for information's sake. For room's sake, but that information is important as those histories build on each other. But today, what I'd like to discuss and look at is Xi Jinping. But in order to understand our present and what's future, we know we've got to go to the past. So we're going way back in the past to understand the emperor of today. So I want to take us back to have a review of, here it is, China's history. Now, China is seen as understood as one of the longest lasting continual civilizations. They mark its history beginning at around 2000 BC. And that's a long way back when you consider the Tower of Babel was about 2100. So 2000 BC is a rough time. So give or take 100 years. Well, take 100 years or give 100 years. Around that time, you can mark the Chinese civilization. And between 2000 BC and 900 AD is what is known as ancient China. Between 900 AD and I'll say 1912, January 1, 1912, is Imperial China. In 1912 was a revolution, began in 1911. But this revolution, there was an uprising and they abolished the Qin dynasty and brought in a republic, what is known as the Republic of China. That's when that began. So you've got around, well, a bit less than 4,000 years of history, and it's a very long and complex history. But there is some a repetition within this history that is worth noting. So it's as I said, it's recognized as one of the longest lasting continual civilizations. Now we know because of Bible prophecy that we consider Babylon to be the longest prophetic civilization, in that this is Babylon and this is Babylon, but that's not how the world sees it. So prophetically, we know Babylon's been around much longer than China, but in secular history, it's considered longest lasting because its culture has relatively remained the same for the continuous from those thousands of years. And what is it that we identify with culture when we talked about culture? If you can remember the Tower of Babel, what identifies a culture?
Language.
And it has had it has a pictograph. So if you think of the hieroglyphics of Egypt, the Chinese have a similar version, different, but it's a pictograph. They're symbols that represent an image that has developed into a language, and it's lasted, it's been a continual written script for thousands of years. There's been, what's the language today? Mandarin. It's only been around for about 100 years. Before that, it was Cantonese, and they're quite different. So the verbal language might have changed, but their written script has remained the same. And we identify that with culture. It's had political continuity despite periods of division and foreign rule. So there were short times when the Mongols took control of China, but they were only short periods. Otherwise, it's been continuous political succession. It's been largely unified for centuries. It's had, which we'll discuss in detail, dynastic succession. So despite the rise and fall of numerous dynasties, it has been dynastical, or had these dynasties for almost 4,000 years. And its influence, philosophical influence by Confucius, has lasted thousands of years. So there's no other civilization that can say that it's had political, philosophical, cultural, dynastic succession like continuity like China. So we mark this period from 2000 BC up to 1912 with dynasties. Now, it depends on how you count them. So some people count that there's been 12 major dynasties. Others will say, well, there were actually 24. And some will say there's been around 80. It depends on how you count the dynasties. But for argument's sake, we're going to say that there's been 24 dynasties in this, across this period. And these are marked by a repeating pattern that's known as the dynastic circle. So picture a circle. And we see a dynasty rise to take control of the country. And the reason that it takes control of the country is because it's received the heaven's mandate. And I'll explain that in a minute. Receives heaven's mandate to rule. And it will rule very well for quite a period of time. Then the people will be happy because they have prosperity. It's a good dynasty. They are caring for their people. Somewhere through their rule, there will begin to be corruption, and the people will not be happy. And that will last a fairly long time until they get really fed up. There'll be increased taxes, there'll be repression, all sorts of bad things will happen, corruption, and the people will get more and more unhappy. And then there'll be some sort of calamity. It might be an internal calamity like a civil war, external, there might be invading forces or wars, there might be a drought or a flood or a famine, and the people will be very unhappy. And they will rise up in rebellion and overthrow the dynasty and replace it. And this is known as justified rebellion. And this is the pattern, this dynastic circle that will repeat itself 12 or 24 or 83 times, depending on how you count dynasties or you work them out, over these thousands of years. So the idea of heaven's mandate started very early back here with one of the earliest dynasties, one of the very first overthrowing of a dynasty, where the incoming people said, you're corrupt, you're not looking after everybody, we want to take control, and the gods have told us that we can. So they called it heaven's mandate, and everyone said, well, the gods have told you, because the gods must be upset because there's been a flood and a famine and people uprising or a pandemic. So when you think of, when we talk about people uprising today, we call that protests. So there's been protests or a pandemic, and that must be a sign from heaven that we need to get rid of you and put somebody else in. And it doesn't matter about the bloodline. It doesn't matter if they're a commoner. There were quite a few dynasties that were started by commoners. You didn't have to be an elite. Didn't matter. But a new dynasty would start, and then it'd be deja vu. It would follow the same pattern. It's similar but different to the European divine right of kings. With the divine right of kings, it was all about the bloodline. Didn't matter if you were corrupt. Didn't matter what state the people were in. If you were a king, you were a legitimate king if you were born into that family. Not so with Chinese dynasties. You could be legitimately overthrown, but it's heaven's mandate that gave you your legitimacy, that said that you were the legitimate rulers. What the heavens mandate did was it gave them 3 assurances. Oh, wrong notes. Sorry. Okay, 3 assurances. 1, you had the right to rule because it was granted to you by the gods, which gave you religious power. You had the right to rule because you cared more about the people than yourselves, which gave you secular power. And the right to rule was not limited to only one dynasty or family. You could be replaced. And this is justified rebellion. So that's the dynastic circle that was characteristic of the Chinese civilization for thousands of years, until we got to 1912. So in 1912, it was the last dynasty was the Qing dynasty, and the people rose up and they didn't replace it with a dynasty. They replaced it with a republic, the Republic of China, which was an authoritarian, nationalistic government. And why did that come about? So let's notice what happens next. 1927 begins the Chinese Civil War, which we talked about in one of the earlier talks. And because you've had the Russian Revolution, which was based on communism, and that ideology has crept into China, and now you have this movement within China that is saying we can make China great again using communist ideology, Lenin thinking. So this begins a civil war that goes to 1949. Civil war. The communists win, and in power becomes the People's Republic of China. And the Republic of China, they flee to Taiwan. The People's Republic of China are now in control. So we've looked at that history. So we've got Civil War. If we go back to 1839, is the first Opium War. Qing dynasty is in power, and the British are invading, and it begins a 100-year history of what the Chinese have a word for it, and it's translated to century of humiliation. Anything that could go wrong goes wrong. So it's not China is not just plagued with internal conflict. There are other empires that are creating trouble for China. So we've got the first Opium War with the British. You have the French take back the areas that are now known as Vietnam. You got the Japanese, I think, took what was Korea and Taiwan. Russia are having incursions upon their border. The Portuguese are involved. Germany is trying to carve up China for itself as well. You name it, everybody wants a finger of the China pie. And it's also rocked by internal division. The Qing dynasty gets overthrown, and it's a real mess. There are huge parts of China that have no government for years. It's total chaos. And they call this period the century of humiliation. So when we get to Civil War and the ROC is fighting the Red Army, which will become the PRC, while they're ideologically opposed to each other on how to make China great again, there's one thing that they really agree on, and that is all their problems are caused by foreign influences. The British, the Portuguese, the Japanese, the Russians, the Germans, the French. All their problems are foreign made. So that's the one thing that they agree on. Okay, so Mao Zedong wins, and he doesn't want anything to do with foreign countries. It's all about make China great again. We do it all by ourselves. And he brings in the Great Leap Forward, which is this agricultural revolution that, long story short, kills between 30 and 45 million Chinese. They starved to death. He was a good revolutionary. He was a bad economist and a bad farmer. So you've got millions of people die post the revolution. Then he gets paranoid and he starts the Cultural Revolution and another million die. So the country kind of has to wait for Mao to die. So when he dies, then they start thinking, it's, you know, you get into the 50s and the 60s and they start to realize the foreigners aren't going to invade us anymore. They're not interested in invading us, but we have to have a legitimate government. How are we going to keep the people happy? So that's then the next step. So and that will take us down to 1979, where they institute economic reforms because they realize they got to do something differently. And then we end up in 1989 and we have protests. And so things aren't going very well. You get to 1989 and there's rumblings right across the country. So let's go and look at what's causing these rumblings that will eventually culminate in the Tiananmen Square massacre. So I'm just going to Wikipedia, 1989 Tiananmen Square protests and massacre. We'll just go down to the second paragraph. The protests were precipitated by the death of pro-reform Chinese Communist Party General Secretary Hu Yaobing in April 1989, amid the backdrop of rapid economic development and social change in post-Mao China, reflecting anxieties among the people and political elite about the country's future. So, and we've talked about Hu Yaobing. The reforms of the 1980s had led to a nascent market economy. So nascent means it's beginning and it has potential to really grow. There's this beginning of a market economy that's looking really promising. But it benefited some people, but seriously disadvantaged others. And the one-party political system also faced a challenge to its legitimacy. So what are we ready for? We're ready for regime change in 1989. Common grievances at the time included inflation, corruption, limited preparedness of graduates for the new economy, and restrictions on political participation. Although they were highly organised and their goals varied, the students called for greater accountability, constitutional due process, democracy, freedom of the press, and freedom of speech. Workers' protests were generally focused on inflation and the erosion of welfare. So generally, all the people aren't happy. These groups united around anti-corruption demands, adjusting economic policies, and protecting social security. At the height of the protests, about 1 million people assembled in the square. But as we discussed before, there were protests right across the country in different cities. Just the beginning of the next paragraph says, as the protests developed, the authorities responded with both conciliatory and hardline tactics, exposing deep divisions within the party leadership. So the party's not strong. Some are saying, oh, look, we need to concede. Let's be conciliatory. Let's give them some of what they want. Others are more hardline. So there's factions within the Communist Party. And the hardliners win out, as we know. But again, in this history where they've realized, you know, it's not foreign invasion we have to worry about, literally, but what is creeping in is foreign ideology and this idea of democracy and free speech and all of those things. So they have to try and find a way to keep the ideology out of the country. It's not like tanks are going to arrive, but different ways of thinking are creeping in. So that's been the history of China up until 19, very, very brief history of just a few thousand years. So in 1989, there's a brutal crackdown, but there's still factions in the party. So where there would have normally been a regime change, it didn't happen this time, but there's still factions. After 1989, we've got Deng Xiaoping is the paramount leader at the time. He will be replaced by Jiang Zemin and then Hu Jintao. And then when we get to 2012, we see Xi Jinping inaugurated as paramount leader. Paramount leader means he is chairman of the military, chairperson of the military, and get his other titles. He's head of the military, I think president of the party, and I can't remember the other one. Anyway, he's president of everything. It'll come to me. So he is now 2012 paramount leader. Then there's still factions. So rebellions have been quieted. We talked about the endless purge was put into practice in 1989, but there's still problems. So what we would do while we've got this line up is we're just going to go through this history and note where Xi Jinping is. I mean, he's right through this history, but note some important waymarks with him. So 2012, he arrives. In 2014, the CCP. So when we say China or Xi Jinping, we're really talking about the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party. It runs everything. It's only about 5% of the population, but it is the ruling party. And yeah, they're kind of synonymous when you're talking about Xi Jinping. So they did this 400 billion gas deal with Russia in 2014. So you remember that there was a time when Russia and China were not friends, and that friendship has been healing during this time period. By 2014, there's real an economic connection. In 2016, Xi and Putin announced that they're friends forever. And I'll just share some couple of articles here. So in 2016, they're friends forever. In 2019, they announced that they're best friends. So let's have a look at that.
Excuse me, Elder Terrie, the board is very blurry.
Yes, I know. What is it that I pointed to that you can't read?
I can't read all of them. You sent us the picture anyway, so yeah, so good.
So you do have a picture of this already. So can you see 2012? Well, this is what it says for 2012, Xi Jinping. For 2016, it says friends forever. In 2019, it says best friends. So we're just going to look at those two markers. Is that any better?
Yep, that's better. Thank you.
actually, before we do that, okay, so we notice in 2012, he has been inaugurated as paramount leader. So let's look at that first. This is an Atlantic article from 2022, and it's called Behold Emperor Xi. For China's leader to rule indefinitely breaks communist tradition, but returns to an imperial one. So we'll just read a little portion of this. Over more than 2 millennia, the emperors of imperial China were the focal points of the state and of the public's veneration, and the central figures in a Sino-centric system of foreign affairs. Have we discussed what Sino is? Have I pointed that out before? Sino is just the Latin for China. In Latin, they don't have a CH. So the CH is replaced with an S, so China becomes Sina. And so whenever you see the prefix Sino, it's just Latin for China. So the emperors were the central figures in a Sino-centric or China-centric system of foreign affairs. So everything's got to revolve around China. As the Chinese empire is rising again, so too is a new emperor. China's current ruler, Xi Jinping, will likely be elevated to similar stature at the 20th Communist Party Congress in Beijing, which begins next week. So that was last year, 2022. He took a third term. These political gatherings, held every 5 years, are used to finalize the lineup of the party's senior leadership, revealing to the nation and to the world the victors of backroom wrangling and brass-knuckled competition. That's because there's factions. This time, Xi, the Communist Party's General Secretary since 2012 and President since 2013, is widely expected to deviate from modern precedent and claim a third term. That would put him in charge until 2027, but he could very well rule indefinitely. If events unfold as anticipated, Xi will emerge from the Congress as the most commanding figure in Chinese politics since Mao Zedong, who ruled almost unchallenged from his founding of the People's Republic in 1949 to his death 27 years later. Yet the event will be more like a coronation than a party conference. Although comparisons between Xi and Mao are inevitable, China's leader today resembles in many respects more of an imperial emperor than a Marxist revolutionary. Mao wished to overturn the established order, both at home and abroad, and fomented political and social upheaval to achieve his goals. Xi's agenda is much more closer to imperial China's. He intends to restore the nation as the dominant power in Asia at the core of a new Sino-centric system, similar in nature to the position it held in the region under the dynasties. This older historical legacy may be the better guide to understanding Xi's foreign policy ambitions. For centuries, the Chinese dynasties formed the political, economic, and cultural center of East Asia. Their influence extended to the far horizons through trade. Xi is seeking to rebuild these ties of influence, and is adopting the tools of the emperors to achieve his aim. Even in antiquity, the emperors claimed that their writ embraced all under heaven. Using 21st century technology, Xi has the opportunity to turn ancient rhetoric into modern reality. So what we want to note is how he is using 21st century technology to turn China into another empire, and he as their emperor. Thank you. All right, so this article is noting that Xi Jinping is going to differ from the leaders before him, and that he is ushering in a new empire, not something that's actually based on communist ideology. Okay, so 2016, friends forever with Putin. So this is a Guardian article. Friends forever. Xi talks up China's ties with Russia during Putin trade trip. Russia and China sealed a raft of energy deals during President Vladimir Putin's visit to Beijing on Saturday, strengthening economic ties while pledging to preserve the strategic balance of power among nations. In what was Putin's fourth trip to China since Xi Jinping became president in 2013, the two men stressed their shared outlook, which mirrors the country's converging trade, investment, and geopolitical interests. Russia and China stick to points of view which are very close to each other or are almost the same in the international arena. Xi emphasized that this year marked the 15th anniversary of the China-Russia Treaty of Friendship and hoped that the two countries might remain friends forever. So that's 2016. Let's go to 2019. 2019. I'm hoping that changed for you. Did that screen change for you? The China-Russia relationship got an official upgrade with the announcement of a 5-point comprehensive strategic partnership based on mutual understanding and win-win cooperation. The two leaders also strengthened their personal ties, receiving an honorary doctorate from the other's alma mater, St. Petersburg State University, and I did look that up, Tsinghua University. That's wrong. Xi told Russian media, President Putin is the foreign colleague that I have interacted with most extensively. He is my best friend, and I greatly treasure our friendship. On a 3-day state visit to Moscow, Putin took Xi on a Neva River cruise to St. Petersburg, where Putin was born in 1952. Xi said the trip was an honor. The fertile land here has bred a number of great people. It is the pride of Russia and its people. So yeah, real besties. Okay. In 2020, we won't be looking at that today because it has to do with the pandemic, but Xi Jinping gave a speech for the World Health Organization. And in 2022, they announced a limitless partnership. So the Beijing Olympics were held in Beijing. Most foreign leaders, a lot of foreign leaders refused to attend, but Putin came. The story is that Xi Jinping knew that he was going to invade Ukraine, but asked him to put it off till after the Olympics. So that can't be verified. But certainly, as soon as the Olympics were over, Putin invaded Ukraine. But before that, they announced their limitless partnership. So we'll take a look at that. Actually, this article, I'll just share with you. Again, this article is taken from (2019), and this is Foreign Policy article. Xi and Putin, best friends forever. This is a transcript of their remarks in Moscow in 2019. Remember, they went on their picnic to St. Petersburg. So this week, Chinese President Xi Jinping traveled to Russia to commemorate the 70th anniversary of diplomatic relations between the two countries. During the trip, the two nations signed several trade agreements and energy deals, and they even welcomed 2 new pandas to the Moscow Zoo. That's a big deal. Like, China is really jealous over its pandas. If they give you a panda, that's like the highest honor. I think just recently they took their pandas back from America. America can no longer have their pandas. The relationship Russian President Vladimir Putin noted had reached an unprecedentedly high point, while Xi called Putin one of his closest friends and great colleague, sentiments that surely sent chills down the spines of Western observers. So we just want to read the opening remarks of each of these men. Putin said, "President Xi Jinping, my dear friend, ladies and gentlemen, I am very pleased to receive President of the People's Republic of China, Xi Jinping, in Russia. This state visit by China's president is taking place in a year that marks an important date, the 70th anniversary of diplomatic relations between our countries. I am pleased to note that Russian-Chinese relations have reached an unprecedentedly high level. This is a truly comprehensive partnership and strategic interaction. Mr. Xi Jinping and I maintain close contact. We regularly exchange visits, talk on the sidelines of international events, and pay close attention to Russian-Chinese cooperation in the political, economic, humanitarian, and other spheres." And he will go on. And if we drop down, let's read what Xi said. Here we go. "Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, friends, good afternoon. I am happy to see you together with my old friend, President Putin. This is my first state visit to Russia during my second term as the head of the Chinese state. This is also my 8th visit to Russia since 2013. President Putin and I have established close working relations and a strong friendship. We have met almost 30 times in the last 6 years. Russia is the most frequently visited foreign country for me, and President Putin is one of my closest friends and a great colleague. This is the best reflection of the high level of bilateral relations and close strategic cooperation between China and Russia. And we've held very productive talks, and on they go." So it's not just, I just don't want to say, yep, they're good mates. They're really pumping it up. And word is that they are actually good friends. But that doesn't mean that Russia and China are good friends. Like they might have a, bromance going on. But Russia, the government, doesn't really trust China, the government, and vice versa, as you would expect. But it's probably a legitimate friendship between the two men. So they announce a limitless partnership in 2022 at the Beijing Olympics. And so that's what that says, 2022 limitless partnership. In 2023, so we're in the middle of the Ukraine war, and Xi Jinping goes to Moscow with a 12-point peace plan. So he's got this idea of how they can bring the war to an end, and it's a really flawed plan. It's not worth the paper it's written on. But he gets involved with the Ukraine war, and he visits on March 20. And why that's significant is because on March 19, the international sorry, the one at The Hague. They
Is that the criminal court?
The criminal court?
The criminal court, thank you. Yes, they issue a warrant for President Putin's arrest because of crimes against humanity. They had taken children from Ukraine. Yes, so on the 19th of March, there's a warrant for Putin's arrest, and on the 20th of March, he gets a visit from his bestie. So yes, that's why that's worth noting. Thank you. All right, so we've just gone through some kind of the main waymarks through this time period, but they're interacting, like they interacted 30 times within a few years period. So it's oh, here we go. Investigation of war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide because of the unlawful deportation and transfer of children from Ukraine to Russia. So it wasn't just Putin. There was a woman who is the Minister for Children or something. So there's two of them where they've got a warrant for their arrest. All right, so that takes us through that history. Now I want to introduce you to somebody. Just rub this out. This man is Martin Dimitrov. Just write his name here. Martin Dimitrov was a Bulgarian by birth. He is now a professor in political science at Tulane University, which is, I think, Louisiana. So Martin was 14 years old in Bulgaria when the Soviet Union collapsed. Now, Bulgaria was one of the Soviet satellite states, and it followed the same pattern as Russia. It collapsed. It started its collapse in 1989. In fact, on the 9th of November, 1989, the Russian president was told to step down. And he did the following day, etc. And that began the collapse of the Bulgarian communist regime. And then it fully collapsed in 1991. So Martin was 14 when the Soviet Union collapsed, and he didn't understand it. And he has spent his lifetime researching it. And he's written a book that was published this year, and it's called Dictatorship and Information: Authoritarian Regime Resilience in Communist Europe and China. So his interest what he began to do was he started comparing the fall of Bulgaria, which mirrors that of Russia, with China. And his question is, why do some regimes collapse and others stay in power? So I'll just share with you some notes from his writings. His interest in China was based on why some communist regimes turn out to be permanent in certain settings. So why do some collapse and others survive? Authoritarian regimes are repressive. So repression is when you control other people or other things. Forcefully control other people. So authoritarian regimes are repressive, but how do they survive when repression is not the main mechanism for ensuring ongoing regime persistence? So it's how do they survive can they survive with just repression? That's the question. So he's going to discuss, and this isn't his term, it's something that has been spoken of before, but he's going to discuss what's known as the dictator's dilemma. The dictator's dilemma. And I just might read straight from there, might make it easier. One of the fundamental challenges of authoritarian governance is the difficulty of obtaining reliable information about the public mood. This problem was first identified in the classic literature on dictatorship, which posited that autocrats operate in an information vacuum because they have no way of ascertaining the common man's views. So when you run an autocratic regime country, you can't tell how the people are thinking. And that's a problem, because then how much repression do you use? How do you balance the repression? And so what happens is that the regimes tend to overly repress. And what happens when you overly repress? When we looked at the dynastic cycle, there will be a rebellion. Ultimately, there will be a rebellion. So you need to know just how much repression to use, or find out other ways of keeping control. So this is the dictator's dilemma, because you just don't know what people are thinking because they're too afraid to say what they think. Subsequent work has built on these foundational ideas, arguing that repression exacerbates this information problem because citizens in dictatorships are unwilling to reveal their true level of support for the system due to fear that criticism will be met with reprisals. Instead of showing their opposition to the regime, individuals engage in preference falsification. They lie, which manifests itself as a reluctant participation in ritualistic acts of public dissimulation, such as compulsory mass rallies and non-competitive elections. So they will go to the rallies and they will vote in the non-competitive elections. So think of some of the elections that have happened that have been rigged. The people have still gone out to vote, even though they know who's going to win. I'm thinking of it's not going to come to me. Anyway, it's like the dictator says, do you love me? And they're like, yes. Do you really, really love me? Yes, we do. They will say what they have to say. They will do what they have to do. And the emperor, the dictator, the autocrat does not know what they're really thinking. And that's the dilemma. Preference falsification makes dictators fundamentally insecure, since they cannot know their true level of support and thus face the risk of being deposed through a revolution or a coup. This produces the theoretical expectation that autocracies will be relatively short-lived. And usually that's what happens. Autocracies don't last long. And yet, here we are with China. How has China lasted since 1989? Well, since even 1949. How has that Communist Party lasted? And he's going to go on to talk about the remarkable longevity of communist dictatorship. And he's going to do that by comparing Bulgaria and China, which may as well be comparing Russia with China. His interest in Bulgaria is because that's where he was born. So when you think about Xi Jinping, there are two things that haunt him. The first is the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1989. We think we understand the history. Nobody understands that history more than the Chinese, the Communist Party. They study it because they are not going to repeat it. They want to learn everything they can about the fall of the communist Soviet Union. There is another history that haunts them. Anybody want to take a guess? If you've got the overthrow in 1989, what other history? Oh, I'll have to turn the board. Do you think that would get them worried? Question without notice. There's been no overthrow in Taiwan, so they're not worried about Taiwan. They just want it, and they'll take it when they feel like it.
Is it when the end of the Qin dynasty? When the imperial dynasties came in?
Okay, no, but that's a good swing of the bat. go to our line, our history. 1989, post 1989, post 2001. Where have we seen regime changes?
Afghanistan or Iran?
All right, you're getting closer. 2008, and what are we marking? The Arab Spring. So if you compare, does that make sense? The Arab Spring with 1989, there's similarities, but there's also differences. Any thoughts about what the difference would be in the reasons for that collapse or the collapse of regimes? What difference? So if I go back to here, it might help. What do we mark? What's 1989 mark prophetically? Time of the end. And what is introduced?
Change of regime.
Yep, just generally.
The
When we
internet.
mark 1989, the internet, World Wide Web.
World Wide Web, yeah.
Now, information had a lot to do with the collapse of the Soviet Union. That's why he's written the book, Dictatorship and Information. He wants to know how information is handled, how the governments handle it, how it affects the mood of the people. But in 1989, how can we compare that to 2008? Arab Spring, what swept that across that area? What was the catalyst with the Arab Spring uprisings?
Is it social media's role in that?
Yes, social media, Facebook. Can I say Twitter? I can't, I don't know. Anyway, but social media platforms, yes. So you don't have that so there's similarities and there are differences. So you can see what would, if you're haunted by these two histories and you want to learn as much from them and you don't want to repeat them, you also need to, be able to control social media. So let's talk about information. So I'll write that up here. Arab Spring. Social media. The role of social media in those uprisings is quite substantial in those uprisings. So back here in 1989, we'll get to that. We'll come back to that. So how do rulers know the mood of the people? So what Dimitrov will explain is how information works in a society. And he says that it works horizontally and vertically. So let's put the dictator up here and the people down here. I better make some. I guess I could have brought that over here. Make some room. Well, draw a straight line. Dictator, people. So there are three main ways to get information about the mood of the people. The first is fair and competitive elections. You know what people think because they can vote. The other thing is to encourage protests. People have the right to protest. You know how the people are thinking. You see how many are turning out, how many are giving support. And the third one is investigative journalism, a liberal media. They're the three ways that information about what the general populace thinks, what they want, what they're happy with, what they're not happy with, how that gets to the dictator or the ruler or anybody in government. The problem is that with these three ways to gather information is that it's horizontal information in that all the people know what all the people think. If you think about the voice referendum now, we've got polls being undertaken. We've got articles being written. You know, we know that the no vote is, you know, has gained on the yes vote, etc. We see protests, we see movements where people are walking in the streets and gathering in parks, etc. There will be a referendum and it will tell the government exactly what the people want and how they're thinking. So it's information that gets spread right across the entire populace. Dictators don't want that. Dictators want only vertical information. So got to get rid of that. We've got to find a way to find out how the people are thinking and take it only directly to the leaders. And this will apparently solve the dictator's dilemma. So when we talk about the internet, actually we'll go back here. In 2001, China joins the World Trade Organization, which we've talked about at length. And that was encouraged. It was really lobbied by the American government, Bill Clinton in particular, and his White House presidency were pushing for China to join the World Trade Organization. There were concerns, there were human rights concerns, there was all sorts of concerns why China shouldn't be allowed to join the World Trade Organization. But one of the concerns was the rising impact of the internet and just how China was going to use that technology. So that was a legitimate concern leading up to the vote to let them into the World Trade Organization. So I just want to share with you a speech that Bill Clinton gave in March of the year 2000. And this is from the New York Times. Clinton's words on China: trade is the smart thing. So these are excerpts from President Clinton's speech at the School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins University. And we'll just read a portion of it. This is Bill Clinton speaking. Most of the critics of the China World Trade Organization agreement do not seriously question its economic benefits. They're more likely to say things like this: China is a growing threat to Taiwan and its neighbors. We shouldn't strengthen it. Or China violates labor rights and human rights. We shouldn't reward it. Or China is a dangerous proliferator. We shouldn't empower it. These concerns are valid, But the conclusion of those who raise them as an argument against China isn't, or China joining the WTO isn't. The question is not whether we approve or disapprove of China's practices. The question is, what's the smartest thing to do to improve these practices? The change this agreement can bring from outside is quite extraordinary. So what Bill Clinton is going to argue is if we let them in and they'll open up their economy and there'll be much more foreign influence, you're going to see that China is going to change. Notice here that the change this agreement can bring from outside is quite extraordinary, but I think you could make an argument that it will be nothing compared to the changes that this agreement will spark from the inside out in China. By joining the WTO, China is not simply agreeing to import more of our products, it is agreeing to import one of democracy's most cherished values, economic freedom. The more China liberalizes its economy, the more fully it will liberate the potential of its people. And when individuals have the power not just to dream, but to realize their dreams, they will demand a greater say. So he's saying that the people will speak up. The people will have much more control if we let them join the WTO. So I just want to go to the bottom of his speech. This is second last paragraph. He says, when China joins the WTO, by 2005, it will eliminate tariffs on information technology products, making the tools of communication even cheaper, better, and more widely available. Half right, half wrong there. We know how much the internet has changed America, and we are already an open society. Imagine how much it could change China. Now, there's no question China has been trying to crack down on the internet. Good luck. That's sort of like trying to nail Jell-O to the wall. Now, you can go on the internet and you can hear Bill Clinton give this speech. And when he says that statement, he's saying it. He's laughing as he's saying it. There's no question China has been trying to crack down on the internet. Good luck. It's like trying to nail jelly to the wall, and the whole room erupts in laughter. They think it's hugely funny. But I would argue to you that their effort to do that just proves how real these changes are and how much they threaten the status quo. It's not an argument for slowing down the effort to bring China into the world. It's an argument for accelerating that effort. So, in short, so the argument was they won't be able to control the internet. The internet's not a hassle. You can't nail it to the wall. Well, it took them a while, but they developed their great firewall, and they've been proving that it can be nailed. It's taken them a while, but China does control the internet in their country. And what they're doing with their internet is providing themselves with information. So we're running out of time, and I'm running out of cohesive notes. But when we think about information going vertically from the people straight to the dictator, it's done using information technology. It's done using surveillance technology. And not only just surveilling their people, because if you think back to 1989, East Germany, the fall of the Berlin Wall, that country, the German Democratic Republic, GDR, is run by the Stasi. The Stasi are their secret police, or their, what's their real title? It's a surveillance state. The Staatssicherheit. It's one of the most hated and feared institutions within communism. It was the Ministry for State Security. So in East Germany, they had 100,000 agents of the Stasi in East Germany undertaking surveillance. They had 170,000 informants. And those 270,000 channels of communication about people couldn't stop the fall of the Berlin Wall. So they can gather information, but sometimes it gets to a point where even all that information is not going to help you keep your regime in power. So these are lessons that China is learning from history. Need information, but you also need other tools with that information to make sure that your regime stays in power. So we'll leave that subject for now. We'll come back to that because we want to look at the role that technology and artificial intelligence is playing in China, how they are using it to legitimize their regime, to take control, and to keep control, I should say, and also how to keep the majority of their citizens content and happy. So so on that note, I might just go back here. What the Chinese regime realized after the total how, you know, Mao Zedong's methods here were just a total failure. Millions of people died. It's, prior to 1989, is they came up with the idea of, I shouldn't say they came up with the idea, but they used the practice of bread and circuses. We'll just write it up here. Bread. Martin Dimitrov speaks of this. Bread and circuses. So by bread, the regime realizes that they have to give their people stuff, consumer goods. They need things. It doesn't matter even if they're just cheap things. This was one of the most poorest countries in the world prior to economic reforms, on a par with how we understand North Korea today. So they started opening up the country and bringing in stuff, consumer goods. Okay, back in ancient times, it'd be called bread. In our times, it'd be called a phone. Circuses, entertainment. So back in Roman times, it might be a Colosseum. In this time, in the Cold War period, it's called the Olympics. In that Cold War, the question was, who's going to win the most gold? Russia, China, or the United States? So entertainment, and I mean, that's just one example. So in this time period, bread and circuses, nothing's changed, but the bread and the circuses develop. So that's why the Beijing Olympics was so huge for China. It brought them together, nationalistic. It was a nationalistic campaign. So you need the technology, the AI to get information, and you also need to give something back to your people. So we're going to look at those more because we're going to compare cities in Xinjiang province, where the Uyghurs are, with the provinces that are the provinces where they're using the same technology and the people are very happy. So where one technology can repress a people, on the other hand, it can keep people content. And we'll talk about that more. So I guess to sum up, we've looked at a very broad history of China, how it has had a continual cycle of dynasties that have followed the same pattern. And then we got to 1989, everything was in place for that pattern to continue, but we saw a hard crackdown. And since that time, it's began the time of the end for China. but they have instituted other means to keep their regime in power. They would think legitimately. So Xi Jinping, as we read, is going to use old tactics, not necessarily communist tactics, to keep in power, to not only to control the people, but we will also look next time, but also to stop the factions within his own party. So you remember 1989, it's not only people protesting, but it's a deeply divided party. So he's had to deal with both of those things, and we'll cover that next time. We looked at the dictator's dilemma, and that is, how do you effectively read the people? You're going to have to use other means than what Western democracies use. You can't have an election because you're a one-party state. There's no such thing as elections. Investigative journalism is to be feared. That was one of the things that they were fighting for in Tiananmen Square. They wanted their media liberalized. And the other thing is, what was the other thing? Protests, the right to protest.
Brilliant.
So in order to counteract that, what you need to do is you need to read the people before it gets to a protest. You need predictive surveillance. What East Germany had on board was they knew what the people were feeling at the time. With the new technology, they can predict what the people might be feeling in the future or what they might do in the future. They have the ability to predict behavior. With that's something the Stasi didn't have, despite their abundance of data that they collected, information that they collected. The data that can now be obtained through technology enables, and combined with AI, enables them to socially engineer their people. And that's what we'll be looking at next time. There is one more thing I'd like to share. Is there any questions so far on what we've done? I've got 5 more minutes. I'm going to share something else. It's a bit different. In 2001. What do we mark that? What waymark do we call that in Acts 27? 2001, first line. Testing you. (9/11).
Eurogliding.
Sidon. Yeah, Eurogliding, you're right. But I'm going to write Sidon. And you remember what Sidon represents?
False prophet.
Say again.
False prophet, Terry.
False prophet. False prophet, which is the US. And there's another characteristic of Sidon. And it is, we come across that in honestly be the last page I turned to. If I give you a clue, Ezekiel 28, Joel 3, what else do we know about Sidon? If I say, give
Refreshing.
you... What'd you say, Wally?
I said refreshing.
Oh, you were, yes, refreshing. Yep, that's right. Yep, anything else?
How
What
about Terry?
do you remember? Yes? Okay, Joel 3, Ezekiel 28. Does that ring a bell with anybody? What do we see along with Sidon?
Islam,
Not in Joel 3 or Ezekiel 28.
Tyre.
Remember, Joel isn't about
Tyre.
Islam. Tyre, threefold union. You always see Sidon, Tyre, and a conglomerate of powers. That conglomerate of powers can change. You know, it can be the coasts of Palestine. It can be the kings of the islands, etc. So we see a threefold power here. So we can see the United States. We can see the false prophet here in this history. We just read the false prophet. Look how Bill Clinton prophesied of what China joining the World Trade Organization would do. You know, it was, and we see the conglomerate of powers because we've got the World Trade Organization. Okay, so we've got our false prophet, we've got our conglomerate of powers. Who are we missing? Tyre. So Tyre's got to be in this history too, which is
The base.
yeah. Bit more information.
Well, the papacy? I don't know what
The
you
papacy. Yeah. So I just want to mark the papacy that in all this history, there are two major waymarks where we see the papacy. The first of them is in 2001. What did the papacy do in 2001? It's a New York Times article, and you can look it up. There's many articles. The Pope apologizes for the Catholic Church's errors in China. Pope John Paul II apologized to China today for errors in the Roman Catholic Church's missions there and expressed his strong willingness to work toward full diplomatic relations with Beijing. Okay, so the Pope has been pressing to normalize relations with China for years, but neither side has said it is prepared to make the changes that diplomatic relations would require. The Vatican still recognizes Taiwan a deal breaker for the Chinese, and China does not allow Catholics to recognize the authority of the Pope. So first step was in October of 2001, where the Pope apologizes for the Catholic Church's errors. So remember that the United States recognized the People's Republic of China as the legitimate China way back in, when was that? It was 1959, wasn't it? No? 1979. In 1979. So there are only, I think, about 14 nations around the world at the moment that currently recognize Taiwan, that have diplomatic relationships with Taiwan. And one of them is the Vatican State. It is the last of the European states that recognizes Taiwan. So in 2001, the papacy makes its first steps to kind of reconcile with China and issues an apology. Then in 2021, oh no, it's 2018, sorry. The Vatican signs an historic deal with China, but critics denounce the sellout. So what happened was China says, okay, you can have Catholic churches, that Catholics can worship freely in China, but we pick your bishops. Do you remember that? An agreement with Beijing on nominating bishops is a step in Pope Francis's bid to repair diplomatic relationships. So we could probably spend a lot of time on this, but I just want to mention it. But this has deeply divided the Catholic Church because their factions are divided, because some are saying you're selling us out, but Pope Francis is adamant that they need to have an alliance with China. So the Vatican and China said yesterday they had signed an historic agreement on the appointment of Roman Catholic bishops, a breakthrough on an issue that for decades fueled tensions between the Holy See and Beijing and thwarted efforts toward diplomatic relations. So this is the only country in the world that picks the bishops. The papacy picks its own bishops, thank you very much, but it's allowing the Chinese government to pick the bishops, choose the bishops in China. That's a pretty big deal. And then we might leave it there. But the fear is that once the Vatican does recognize, once that rift is healed and the Vatican does recognize China as the legitimate China and opens diplomatic relations with China, which means it will have to close the diplomatic relations with Taiwan, that most of the other countries will follow suit, because all the other countries that have diplomatic relations with Taiwan, so like there's only 13 or 14 of them, are South American Catholic countries. And then they'll just fall like a house of cards. And there'll be very few, if any, countries that will be recognizing and have diplomatic relations with Taiwan, which will put Taiwan in a worse position. So that's just something to keep in mind, is we can mark Tyre, we can mark the papacy in 2001, and then also again in 2018. And I think there might be more on that, but we'll leave it there for the moment. So any thoughts or questions? We might close with prayer, and then we can talk for a little while if need be. So if you bow your heads. Our loving God in heaven, we thank you for the insight that we have on the World Wide Web and the time of the end, and how the nations are angry and are gathering, and the prophetic insight into how that looks for us today, that you have taken away the veil that had a stereotypical understanding of how nations react with each other, interact with each other. So we ask that you will continue to help us so that we can understand the time that we're living in and the future that is before us. I pray, Lord, for all your people and for the remainder of this Sabbath day, that it may be spent in worthwhile pursuit. And we ask for your continued presence and guidance, and we ask in Jesus' name, amen.